Well, thanks very much, Indy. So the organisation I come from, in some ways, is a very privileged one. We are a funder. After many years of desperately spending my life begging money out of institutions, I decided to go and work for one which had some money, which is a nice privilege. And so we spend it on investment, social investment, research, practical projects, healthcare, collaborative consumption, you name it, and occasionally publishing very eminent authors such as Indy Johar, whose civic compendium is highly recommended if you haven't seen it. Whenever I come into this building, I feel a twinge because my family actually migrated here from New Zealand, and I've always assumed I would migrate back at some point, probably just before the end of the world, because New Zealand's a really good place to be in when the rest of the world is collapsing. And I keep wondering whether I've missed the boat. But maybe some of you will know. And I also always feel a twinge of actually admiration, envy, coming into hubs and meeting all of you, because this is an extraordinary movement you've built up. I was a couple of weeks ago with Alberto and others in Milan, Hub Milan, and said to them, which is true, the other thing I feel when I walk into hubs comes from a guy who was my mentor about 15, 20 years ago, called Michael Young, who was a very successful serial social entrepreneur in the 50s, 60s, 70s, long before the term sort of became fashionable again. In the 90s, he set up the School for Social Entrepreneurs to create people like him, and that's now spread around the world. And in his very late in life, he said, what we really need are social business parks and incubators, places where incredibly creative people, young and old, he was then in his 80s, come together, create ventures, etc. And in his early 80s, started trying to create for-profit companies to sell to venture capitalists to pay for creating buildings. And at the age of 84, he sold his first companies to venture capital, set up his first building at the age of 85, and then unfortunately died. But you sort of started a lot earlier. But when I see hubs, I know that was exactly what was in his mind. What I thought I would talk about briefly is in some ways very simple, but I think also very difficult, which is how does it feel and how do you cope with being part of revolutions? Because I think that's what we are in, and probably each of you as individuals is in, and most of the people in your buildings are in. And let me explain what I mean. I think there's at least two overlapping senses in which we probably are in a revolutionary period, or at least a pre-revolutionary period. One is that 5 years after the financial crash, in almost every field, it seems to me, the old institutions are still not weak enough to die, whether that's banks or governments or big corporations, and they're hanging on and they're demanding money to be shored up as never before, and yet the new is actually too weak to take over. The new forms, the new models, the new enterprises, the new movements are still essentially on the margins, even when they're succeeding. And so we have this kind of stalemate between an essentially stagnant, incapacitated set of incumbents and a set of kind of insurgent revolutionaries who have the energy and the ideas but aren't strong enough yet to defeat the old powers. It's a very classic situation that happened many, many times in history. And overlapping that, I think, is a revolution in how innovation is done, which, again, you are part of. When I was a child, innovation meant big labs in big companies, big science, big budgets, men in white coats coming up with the next generation, microprocessor or nanotechnology. We are now maybe a third of the way through, who knows, a process of radical democratization of the very process of innovation itself, when far more people can play a part in creating the new in all its forms. Many of the things we're involved in are essentially around these new tools of innovation. So, an example is prizes or challenge prizes, inducement prizes, where for me the best example was last year's Intel prize when a 15-year-old won it for a new way of testing for pancreatic cancer. And he'd taught himself on the internet how to come up with a new test which was 1,000 times more effective and cheaper than what the big labs had come up with. It's about the proliferation of new startup tools, startup factories, accelerators, incubators happening all over the world, but trying to democratize, in some ways, the creation of new business. We have 1,001 experiments with crowdfunding and crowdsourcing and crowd this and that, most of which aren't quite working, but they're all, again, part of trying to find much more open, much more democratic ways of generating new ideas and making them happen. There's the whole sort of maker movement in and around manufacturing, and we now run a big program on digital making, getting teenagers in schools programming, coding, making Arduino, robots, you name it. And I could go on and on. Almost every field, so it's the job of creating the new, which was in some ways just for a small group of highly skilled elites, often in science, has been dramatically opened up, and I think will continue to be opened up, in part because those old innovation structures are not working very well at all. Pharmaceuticals being the perhaps paradigm industry where their innovation model, incredibly expensive, but essentially not working at all. And for me, one of the best examples of this was where I spent my afternoon yesterday in Stevenage, probably not a place any of you have visited, as you were going to build tree houses in Norfolk or whatever it was yesterday. Stevenage is not one of the most exciting towns in Britain, but there is one of a new network of schools which I've been involved in called Studio Schools, where most of the curriculum is done through real-life projects, working with businesses, working with social entrepreneurs, and getting young people in teams working on very practical problem solving. So I spent an afternoon with a bunch of 14 and 15-year-olds who had done pretty badly at school beforehand, but were doing things like running the social media for lots of the town's businesses. They were about to take over all the local media for a week and actually run them, and all sorts of projects of that kind, which mobilize that sense that you can actually make and shape things. And they then actually do dramatically better in their formal exams, which is why it gets the support of the educational establishment as well. But essentially, it's about turning from a passive recipient model of education to the idea everyone can make, shape their world, and indeed has to. And if by the age of 18 you haven't got the real-life experience of doing that, you're not really ready for the world. That's kind of the good side. And I guess I could add to that things like the refashioning of money, so that money begins to flow into socially useful things. You're hearing from Nigel in a minute, and there's a lot happening around the world on social investment and social finance. We now have this £600 million bank here, big society capital, set up by tapping into unclaimed bank accounts. So if in any of your countries have unclaimed bank accounts, and you all will, try and get hold of that money because it's transforming the social investment scene here in the UK. That's sort of the good news. So why is it difficult to be part of a revolution? Well, if any of you have read history books, you'll know that revolutions often consume their revolutionaries. They often kill them. They often drive them mad. They often drive them to battle against each other and so on. And that's undoubtedly going to be true. The more turbulent things become, the more we may be in for a bit of a hair-raising sort of roller coaster ride over the next few years, where each of you at some points will feel total frustration that nothing is happening, you can't get anything to work, and then suddenly you'll become flavour of the month, and everyone will want to shower you with money, give you vast projects, and so on. And I think it's important to be ready for this. So what I thought I'd do is just mention 5 or 6 of kind of the challenges of being in the middle of a revolution. And some of these are very practical ones, and some of these are perhaps more psychological ones. I think the first challenge, and it's one which I really learnt from the guy I mentioned at the beginning, Michael Young, is humility. What to me went most wrong with the social entrepreneurship movement in the 90s and a bit the last decade was it tried to make people so full of themselves as change makers of the world that actually they lost the humility you need to be useful to people around you. And part of me thinks it's a good thing that most Harvard MBAs now want to be social entrepreneurs. And there is in some ways a really good aspect to this, that it's become so desirable, so fashionable. I would rather they were doing that than being investment bankers. But it comes with this risk of ego, and actually brittle ego, which then can't cope when you face the setbacks, the rebuffs. Whereas people who become social entrepreneurs out of their own life stories, their own pains, their own problems, are usually much more resilient. So cultivating humility more than arrogance, I think, is a really important sort of thing through this period of change. There's a few very practical things which I think are important in terms of success. I just yesterday wrote a blog on digital technologies, really saying that the biggest priorities for the next year or two are not about coming up with yet more apps and programs and codes, good as those are. We've got a far bigger problem about usage, making the ones we have actually work in practice, in use. And there's a whole set of missing roles of intermediation and development and linking to customers, which is where the energy should be going. And the techie people don't like this message because it's much more fun coming up with new technologies, but actually for success, is a bit of a sort of mental shift needed from production to use. In almost every field we're working in, business models are really important. And because we are in a period of such fundamental economic change, it's not surprising that there is great uncertainty and fluidity about which business models will actually work. And most people who come through our doors have the wrong business model to start with, and need a lot of help getting to workable ones. But this is almost certain to be more and more important in the next few years, and it's something which has struck me in the kind of people in hubs around the world. Often they will need a lot of help to get to a business model which will generate any kind of sustainable income, let alone enough to employ a few other people. And I feel we don't have enough orchestration of really sort of craft knowledge about which business models are working, which ones are failing, and why. On scaling, we've done lots and lots of work on different methods of scaling and growing and so on, and scaling is almost certainly the wrong metaphor for most people involved in social innovation. To summarize a huge amount of sort of work on this, usually I think people haven't really thought why they want to scale or how they want to scale. And the one thing I would say for anyone who's a sort of startup entrepreneur, usually the process of scaling is really painful because nearly always you lose control of your baby. And we need a much more honest conversation about the virtues and vices of scaling in its different forms. There's still often a very simplistic conversation essentially drawn from business, which doesn't work very well in the social field. If you are wanting to scale, though, an important point, and it's one which Indy is very apprised of, is often what's most important for you as a customer, not an investor. And I'm really keen to see more models of incubation and acceleration which bring in first customers, whether they are large companies or public organizations, and help people get much faster to the first serious contract, because meeting the terms of that contract probably is a better learning experience than almost anything else you can do. And again, a lot of the accelerators we see, I think, are flawed because they don't have enough, again, usage, customer pull built into their design early enough. At a much grander level, I think we're in a period where systems are incredibly challenging. I'm convinced that many of our most fundamental systems are essentially broken. It's clear in the case of finance. It's also true in fields like healthcare, where we're just pouring more and more money into essentially antiquated models of hospital-based healthcare which don't work very well. We have food systems which are brilliant at distributing food to people but lousy at promoting health or avoiding obesity, and so on and so forth. And almost field by field, the basics of life, from energy to food to money, you can see how radically we need to reshape our systems, and how over the next 20 or 30 years there can be an alignment between, as it were, the high-level policies and regulations and so on to shift energy, food, money, and the work of individual entrepreneurs coming up with the really creative ways of making that happen. But it's incredibly hard to predict how it will happen, and the interaction between the sort of the big systems elements and the actions of an individual entrepreneur or group or team or network are really difficult. And that's why On the one hand, I think we need a more sophisticated understanding about how we think of our own roles in systemic innovation, something we've done quite a lot of work on at Nesta. But also, again, it's this resilience to be ready for the roller coaster that is likely to involve. Because systems often change in sudden bursts of realignment, which then suddenly create massive new spaces for people to fill, and often they're not ready to fill that space when luck comes along. Louise is going to talk, I hope, later about SIX, which in some ways is a kind of sister network to the Hub, Social Innovation Exchange, which just this month has kind of relaunched itself as essentially a cooperative of social innovation organizations around the world. And we're very keen that we deepen the collaboration, I think, between SIX and the Hub, very much working in similar spaces. But again, for SIX, the starting point has always been how do we become much better at the practical details of doing our job well. Not just the kind of the high rhetoric about social change, that's easy, we can all do that. But what does that really mean in terms of using design or using finance, or what organizational models do you choose? And I still feel as a field we need to become much cannier at our practical craft, because we will be, as in all revolutions, in conflict often with much more powerful institutions who have many more resources to draw on and much more experience. And so in some ways the insurgents have to be smarter than the incumbents, otherwise they're beaten. I guess the very final point is really about that, and it's something which, again, I sort of learnt from Mr. Young, the social entrepreneur, was that almost the biggest challenge in the kind of fields you're working in and being in the middle of a revolution is to keep two almost completely opposite mentalities in balance. One of which is hyper-optimistic, hyper-ambitious, even sometimes arrogant, that you have the insights, the answers, the ideas, and others don't. And if you don't have some of that, you won't break through the barriers, the people saying it won't work, or it's been done before, or all the things we know people say. But on the other hand, just as much humility to listen really hard, to get right stuck into the toil, the mud, the daily graft of making things happen. If you can get those two in balance, you can be phenomenally effective. But if you overlap and get out of balance, you risk becoming, like so many revolutionaries in the past, part of the problem rather than part of the solution. But I'm sure you're all, having made your tree houses, fully aware of that. Thank you.